At the start of the 14th century, England faced a serious problem. Its armies had suffered a string of humiliating defeats at the hands of the Scots, the worst being the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. There, King Edward II's troops, despite outnumbering the Scottish infantry 3-1, were routed and suffered massive losses. Bannockburn was a disaster for England, and a wake-up call that the old English military system was in desperate need of change. It was Edward III who finally addressed these shortcomings. He reformed England's armies so profoundly and lastingly that some historians even describe his reforms as a military revolution. The result was a war machine that proved almost unbeatable on the battlefield, combining the steadfastness of dismounted men-at-arms with the deadly firepower of longbowmen. In this video, we'll explore how Edward III's reforms transformed England's armies and laid the foundations for the rise of the longbowmen. The basis for Edward III's reformed military system was a different approach to recruitment. Under Edward I and Edward II, English armies consisted mainly of men raised through royal commissions of array and feudal summons, vassals bound to the king by feudal obligation. Edward III gradually replaced this system with contract armies, forces recruited through written agreements and paid full wages for their service. These military service contracts were known as indentures. By 1359 to 1360, when Edward personally led an army in the field for the final time, nearly his entire force had been recruited through service contracts, and feudal levies had fallen out of fashion almost entirely. A contract army was formed as follows. The king entered into agreements with selected captains, usually his vassals or other influential men, who pledged to raise a retinue of a specified number of soldiers in exchange for payment. These contracts outlined the length and location of service, rates of pay, required equipment, and even details like the division of spoils of war. The captains then recruited their troops, either from among the men of their own estates or by making similar agreements with local nobles and individual men-at-arms. Armies raised through this system offered several advantages. Since the captains were responsible for recruiting their own retinues, the administrative burden on the crown was reduced, and it became much easier to raise multiple armies at once. This was a major benefit during the 100 Years' War, when England was often fighting on several fronts, in Aquitaine, Brittany, and France, as well as Scotland. The contracts also allowed the king to more accurately predict how many troops would be available, making the logistical and strategic planning of campaigns far more efficient. Some of the armies raised by indentures were enormous. The force Edward III led during the Crecy campaign is estimated to have numbered over 15,000 men, and by the time he laid siege to Calais, his army had grown to around 25,000. However, this was likely the largest army England fielded until the 16th century, and thus is an exceptional case. Most contract armies were smaller than those raised through feudal levies, but their reduced size was offset by superior quality. Captains determined the size of their own retinues, and since they were paid by the crown, they had little reason to burden the king with unfit soldiers. Each captain brought men he trusted who had already proven themselves in battle. As a result, troops recruited through this system were generally better trained and equipped. Additionally, in contract armies, cavalry and infantry were not raised separately, but rather together by a single captain as one contingent. The men in an indentured retinue usually came from the same area, often even from the same village or hundred. They knew one another, bonded through service, kinship, and friendship, and often had fought together before. This created stronger cohesion than in mixed contingents. Combined with reliable pay, at least in theory, this made contract armies more effective and dependable. But to reach their full potential, they lacked one essential element: strong leadership. Even the most reliable troops are useless if they are poorly led, and that was one of the biggest problems of the old English armies. Edward II was seen as a weak king and an ineffective general. Edward III was the complete opposite, an outstanding strategist, a quick-witted tactician, and a careful, prudent leader. The nobility supported him because he consistently excelled at advancing the war against France, and he knew how to inspire his troops while maintaining discipline, often by staying close to the men himself. He loved fighting alongside them, sometimes even in disguise, wearing the simple tunic of a common man-at-arms. At least as important as Edward III's personal leadership was the network of capable commanders he built. This was crucial because, as mentioned above, the 100 Years' War was often fought on multiple fronts. Edward actively promoted military talent. In 1348, he created the Order of the Garter, an elite military brotherhood that included not only the highest nobility, but also knights and men from the lower nobility. This new military elite gained invaluable experience in the endless battles of the 100 Years' War, and by recruiting through indentured retinues, the king could choose and promote the most capable captains. By the end of Edward's reign, a professional cadre of experienced commanders had emerged, a community of professionals able to plan complex strategies and carry them out effectively. These commanders also led according to a new set of principles. They set a good example, motivated their soldiers through direct engagement and exhortation, and maintained strict discipline. An excerpt from Edward III's speech before the Battle of Crécy shows how this looked in practice. Quote, "On pain of the noose, none should break ranks, nor seek gain, nor despoil either living or dead, without his leave. For if the affair went in their favor, each would have enough time to pillage, and if fortune turned against them, then nothing they could do would gain them anything." Discipline and order often clashed with soldiers' natural desire to plunder or seek personal glory in battle. Yet the English quickly learned that their chances of survival improved drastically if they held their ground and stayed in formation. Against the massive French armies, it was essential to maintain order until the commander gave the signal to plunder, the infamous command, havoc. These improvements at the command level quickly trickled down to the ranks. From dukes commanding entire armies to humble men-at-arms leading small retinues, the quality of leadership rose noticeably. The soldiers quickly realized their leaders were competent, building trusts that in turn boosted morale. As the wars against the Scots and the early campaigns of the 100 Years' War began to bring success, English troops developed remarkable self-confidence. Quote, "The English," wrote the chronicler Jean Froissart, "never let it worry them if they were few in numbers." Fueled by this confidence and shaped by the experience in the brutal early years of the war, England's soldiers fought not only more skillfully, but also more resolutely. The combination of good leadership and high-quality contract armies laid the groundwork of the rise of the Longbowmen and the emergence of a new tactical system. From the 13th century onward, English armies relied heavily on longbowmen. Until the 1320s, most fought on foot and were drawn from the poor and rural population. This began to change during the military reforms of the 14th century. Edward III increasingly used mounted archers, which allowed him to boost the mobility, range, and tactical flexibility of his armies without sacrificing the longbow's deadly firepower. The archers still fought on foot in battle, but used horses to move around quickly between positions. The true value of mounted archers lay in their mobility. They could cover large distances quickly and reposition with ease, making them far more flexible than infantry archers. This allowed them to respond effectively to rapid maneuvers of the French cavalry, and to meet the logistical demands of long campaigns in enemy territory. Most importantly, their speed made them ideal for operations based on surprise and rapid movement. This gave rise to one of the tactics that would come to define the 100 Years' War, the chevauchée. Chevauchées were raids in which mounted units advanced deep into enemy territory to plunder, destroy resources, and pressure the opponent. Over time, chevauchées became one of the English army's most powerful tools in the war against France. Precisely because mounted archers were mobile, they could also be used offensively in battle. A striking example came in 1346, when Henry of Grosmont, the Earl of Derby, rushed to relieve the besieged fortress of Auberoche. Outside the town, Derby's forces of 300 men-at-arms and 600 mounted archers rode swiftly up to the French camp of around 7,000. The archers took up position in front of a grove to the west, while most of the men-at-arms approached from the south, and a small group of dismounted men-at-arms struck from the northwest. The French were completely unprepared. They were sitting around their campfires having dinner when a hail of arrows fell upon them, and the men-at-arms charged into the camp. With a force of infantry archers, a quick assault like this would have been nearly impossible. It would have taken them far too long to get into position. Mounted archers proved so effective in Edward's campaign against the Scots and in the early years of the 100 Years' War that he steadily increased their numbers. By the 1330s, most archers were mounted, and the overall population of archers in the army continued to grow. Soon, English armies were usually roughly half men-at-arms and half mounted archers, while other troop types became less important. From the 1380s on, archers even outnumbered men-at-arms, a trend that continued in the following decades. At the famous Agincourt campaign in 1415, the ratio of archers to men-at-arms was about 3 to 1, and by the mid of the 15th century, it was not uncommon to see 10 mounted archers for every man-at-arms. This overwhelming proportion gave English armies far more firepower per soldier than any other European army. Of course, mounted archers had their drawbacks. The most obvious was cost. Horses and equipment made them far more expensive than ordinary infantry archers, and this was reflected in their pay. A mounted archer typically earned around twice as much as one of his comrades on foot. This further contributed to armies becoming smaller, though that wasn't necessarily a disadvantage. Small, fast, and powerful armies proved their worth again and again in the early stages of the 100 Years' War. Of course, having a horse wasn't enough. A mounted archer needed to know how to care for it, maintain his equipment, repair his bow, and keep himself fed and healthy on campaign. Skills that took years to develop. And if you think about it, that kind of practical, hands-on knowledge is something we've largely lost today. Which brings us to today's sponsor, the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. This isn't your average survival manual. It's a beautifully illustrated guide packed with practical knowledge. Everything from purifying water and building shelter, to protecting your livestock, making soap, or even figuring out how to produce penicillin or gunpowder from scratch. Every page features detailed hand-drawn sketches that make it as enjoyable to browse as it is useful to read. Whether you're just curious about old-world skills or want to be ready for anything, the book is both a fascinating read and a great conversation piece. I've got a copy in my living room and it never fails to grab people's attention. You can grab yours through the link in the description or the pinned comment. It's the one book you'll be glad to have if things ever go sideways. The growing importance of mounted archers had a profound impact not only on the strategic and tactical capabilities of English armies, but also on the social status of the archers themselves. By the 14th century, most mounted archers no longer came from the poor rural population. Instead, they were drawn from the yeomanry, relatively wealthy landowners or tenants, who ranked between landed gentry, such as knights and esquires, and simple peasants. These were men of local influence, who did not hold formal titles of nobility, but played an important role in their communities. This shift was closely tied to wealth. Not everyone could afford a horse, even a simple mount for an archer. Consequently, a minimum income was required to become a mounted archer. Edward III formalized this in the winter of 1344-45 with a decree. Men with land worth £2 or more were to serve as archers. Those with £5 or more as mounted archers, those with £10 or more as hobelars, and men with land worth more than £25 as men-at-arms. To put this into context, it's estimated that only around 11,000 families in 14th century England had an income of more than £5 per year. The social background of mounted archers was still diverse, ranging from the sons of landed gentry to small landowners and artisans. On average, however, they increasingly stood out from ordinary infantry, if only visually because they could afford better equipment. The social gap between men-at-arms and archers, on the other hand, gradually became less obvious. In a royal army, many archers and men-at-arms held similar social and financial status. It was not uncommon, for example, for the eldest son of a wealthy family to serve as a man-at-arms, while a younger brother served as a mounted archer. Still, archers were never equal to men-at-arms in role or responsibility. They always served as retainers and did not command their own retinues. Military service also offered opportunities for social advancement for these new archers. Just as a simple knight could earn a title of nobility by distinguishing himself in the wars in France, a yeoman archer could rise to the rank of knight. A notable example is the famous condottiere John Hawkwood. He began his military career as an archer, was knighted for his achievements in the 100 Years' War, and eventually became one of the most sought-after mercenary captains in Europe. You can click the info card in the top right corner if you want to know more about John Hawkwood and the Italian condottiere in general. Archers' change in social status also had practical effects. England's new mounted archers were no longer simple peasants who went to war because they had to. Some still lived modestly, but most were well-fed, healthy, and took pride in their craft. They saw themselves as professionals, skilled archers who excelled at their art. This new sense of professionalism and the closer social ties between archers and men-at-arms made possible the single most important factor in England's military success: the close cooperation between the two. Unlike in France, where the noble knights often looked down on the ordinary infantry, the English succeeded in elevating their relationship between men-at-arms and archers to a professional partnership. Both groups understood that survival in battle depended on the other. It was their close cooperation that allowed the Longbowmen to play a central role on the battlefield. Let's see how it worked in practice. On the battlefield, the English relied on a tactical system that combined the deadly firepower of longbowmen with the steadfastness of dismounted men-at-arms. The men-at-arms typically held the center, while the archers took positions on the wings. Together, they established a strong defensive line, reinforced with field fortifications, and waited for the attack. As the enemy approached, the archers unleashed a hail of arrows, slowing the advance and disrupting the attackers' formation. While the casualties were often severe, the arrows rarely stopped the enemy before they reached the English lines. There were also blind spots in the defense, and the French quickly adapted. Beginning in the 1350s, they began fighting more on foot, wearing better plate armor and protecting themselves with large shields known as pavises. When the enemy reached the English lines, it was the men-at-arms' moment to act. They formed the backbone of the battle formation, the resilient core around which the archers were arranged. Their job was to halt the attack and hold the line, while arrows continued to rain down over their heads onto the advancing enemy. As soon as the enemy faltered, the men-at-arms mounted their horses, launched a swift counterattack, and pursued the retreating forces. This tactical system was the cornerstone of English success in the early battles of the 100 Years' War. The combination of dismounted men-at-arms and mounted archers proved so effective that other units gradually became less important and eventually disappeared from Edward III's armies. Crossbowmen were soon used almost exclusively in sieges and aboard ships, while mercenary archers were rarely hired. The spearmen from Wales, who had long protected the archers, were replaced by pitfalls, earthworks, and the infamous archers' stakes. Light cavalry units, known as hobilars, whose main weapon was the long lance, also essentially vanished from English armies. The roles of all these units were largely taken over by mounted archers who, in the words of historian Matthew Strickland, became England's, quote, universal soldier, a versatile mounted infantryman capable of performing nearly any kind of engagement. If you want to read the books of Matthew Strickland yourself, you can buy it through our link, which you'll find down below in the description of the video. This also supports the channel because we earn a few dollars if you choose to buy through our link. This versatility proved invaluable in the conflict of the 100 Years' War, where battles were only a small part of the fighting. Sieges, naval operations, and chevauchées were far more common. Mounted archers were ideally suited for all of these, since they were not just archers, but also light cavalry, capable of rapid movement and flexible tactics. Mounted archers were especially versatile during sieges, proving effective in both attack and defense. They could encircle a fortress in an instant, secure siege lines against sallies and external attacks, man siege towers, or provide cover for men-at-arms attempting to storm the walls. The effectiveness of their covering volleys was impressively demonstrated in 1345, when the Earl of Derby attacked Bergerac. For reasons unknown, French troops were positioned outside the town, and a battle ensued. Derby's archers pinned them down near their camp with a dense barrage of arrows, while the men-at-arms struck first on horseback and then on foot. They put the French to flight, pursued them to the suburb of St. Madeleine, and even captured the fortified outer courtyard on the south side of the bridge over the Dordogne. Throughout the battle, the English archers repeatedly shifted position to maintain covering fire for the men-at-arms. Mounted archers were just as effective at defending towns. From the walls, they could keep the attackers at a distance and create the element of surprise during sorties and counterattacks. During the 1342 siege of Hennebon in Brittany, the French bombarded the town for several days with a massive trebuchet. One night, the garrison dared to make a sortie to put an end to the murderous barrage. Several dozen archers snuck up to the siege engine and unleashed a hail of arrows, forcing its guard to retreat. They then defended the position while other infantrymen destroyed the trebuchet. When the French rallied and counterattacked, more archers sallied forth and drove them back. Longbowmen also played a crucial role in amphibious operations. 2 days after the Battle of Bergerac, Derby attacked the town again, this time from the slow-moving waters of the Dordogne. The archers on his ships, quote, kept up so quick an attack with their arrows that none dared to show themselves, unless they chose to run the risk of being killed or wounded, end quote. In the Middle Ages, naval warfare was characterized by a simple tactic. Ships would approach the enemy, weaken them with missiles, fire, and ramming, and then engage in close combat to board the opponent. The longbowmen usually manned the fore and after castles, the superstructures on the bow and stern. From there, they forced the enemy crew to take cover and provided covering fire for their own men-at-arms when they were storming enemy ships or landing on a defended beach. There are many more examples, but these provide an idea of how remarkably versatile mounted archers were. As true, universal, or all-purpose soldiers, they gave England's armies, which would soon consist almost entirely of archers and men-at-arms, the flexibility to respond quickly and effectively to any challenge. Edward III's reforms transformed England's poorly led, insecure, and inefficient forces in a disciplined, professional, and highly effective war machine. The close cooperation between men-at-arms and mounted archers became the foundation of a new tactical system. Side by side, dismounted men-at-arms and mounted archers gave English armies a striking power that secured victories in famous battles such as Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, changing the balance of power in Europe for generations to come. If you enjoy the illustrations in our videos, consider checking out our coloring book that we recently released on Amazon. It features both colored versions and line art, so you can use the art from the video as inspiration. And it also gives you a few previews because it features art that will be released only in future uploads.